So the purpose of this film and short lecture is to alert you to a moral dilemma that you are a part of just by being in this class. Now you might be asking yourself, well, what's a moral dilemma? Well, a moral dilemma is when you are clearly involved in an important circumstance or decision, but it's not exactly clear what you're supposed to do in that situation. So what's the dilemma? Well, it's a surprise, but we'll get to that. So the next thing that you might be wondering is, why me? Why am I involved in this moral dilemma? And my response is pretty straightforward. You're different than other classmates that I've had. You're not just interested in psychotherapy, and you're not just interested in spirituality. You're interested in both psychotherapy and spirituality. So the next question we need to address is, what is an interest in psychotherapy? So I think an interest in psychotherapy is an interest in improving people's lives by influencing their thinking for the better through some kind of relationship. Now, relationship here is defined pretty broadly. It's going to depend, of course, on the kind of therapy you're interested in, but at a minimum, it's probably going to include talking and listening, and it might include other things like empathizing, resisting, recognizing, planning, prescribing, advising, coaching, holding, or a whole host of other things that you might do. The other thing I want to point out is that if you're trying to influence people's lives for the better through thinking, clearly you get that thinking matters a lot. Now, it doesn't mean you buy into the whole effect of water crystals with your mind thing, but it probably means, at minimum, that you realize people have habits of thinking that are sort of important and last a long time. So then the next question is, what is an interest in spirituality, and what does that say about a person? So spirituality, well, it's like, you know what it's like when, I mean, spirituality has got to depend on how we live, right? If there's anything like spirit out there that means anything, I mean, if it can affect us, whether it's a human spirit or some kind of other spirit, it's got to be wrapped up in culture and custom if it's making a difference. I mean, it's not too radical, right? It's just the same old line. What difference does it make what you believe if it doesn't change what you do? So, I think this is where the ethical side of things comes in. I mean, it just seems to me like if you say you're interested in spirituality, then you really ought to be equally interested in the forces that affect what people can do, how they can live. Which is why we're here, really, at the center of modern spirituality, I guess. I mean, you can't do the history justice in a short film, but I think it used to be you'd have to talk about the church, families, the state, schools, traditions, technologies, armies, cultural artifacts, and ideas to capture all the important influences on a way of life. But now, I don't know, all those forces still operate, of course, but their influence is waning, I think. They're all getting pushed in the same direction by this force, by these guys. Let me explain. This is a horse, I guess. You know, people used to, get around on these things. We used to use them as transportation pretty much exclusively. And when we use horses for transportation, I guess we had kind of a shared transit system. Not exactly mass transit, but not exactly private transit either. Maybe you think it was all kind of unethical, riding on these animals like that. I just think they're kind of weird, so silent and passive. If you ask me, we bred and trained all the spirit out of them long ago. Now they're more dead than alive. Not like horses, like horse-shaped zombies. And this is a car, I guess. Now, we all know the story. When we started moving towards cars, we started moving towards a private transportation system. Not so much in New York, but pretty much everywhere else. This is how people get around, at least in this country. And we don't share too often. I mean, of course, give each other rides sometimes, but for the most part, people use their own cars, not other people's cars. And of course, this was very profitable for the auto industry, and no doubt their profits are some part of the reason we started using this system and it continued to expand. But actually, they're not the main reason that everyone has a car. Because you see, there are people for whom it is much more profitable than it is even for the auto industry if everyone has a car. And those people are these people. Let me explain. You see, the auto industry's income scales with the number of people who buy cars, but so do their costs. I mean, if they can build really big factories because they have a huge market, of course they're going to save some money in the amount of labor, but in the long run, whether they make 10 million cars or 100 million cars, the amount of profit per car isn't going to change all that much. But for these guys, it's not like that. In fact, it's extremely different. Because for these guys, if 10 million people are buying cars, that means probably the 10 million people who can actually afford cars are buying cars, which means probably no one has to take out a loan to buy a car. But if 100 million people are buying cars, that means probably a whole lot of people are buying cars who can't afford cars, and that means probably a lot of people are taking out loans to buy cars. So if you're upset that we've all got to drive around by ourselves all the time because everyone has cars, actually the people to get mad at probably aren't the car companies, because really if we all wanted less cars, they'd just make less cars and they wouldn't be all that much less profitable. It's really the banks that make the big bucks when we all decide that we all need something. And these are houses. You've probably seen some like them. In the United States, there's probably about 3 or 4 people living in houses like these. It's great if you really like your space, but it's actually pretty awful if it's important to you to be sort of around people most of the time. I mean, I'm not trying to suggest that the only way to be spiritual is to be like a hippie and be laying on top of people 24/7, but I think it is pretty unprecedented that people live as far apart from each other as they do these days. And not just far in terms of space. I mean, of course, we're very close to millions of people in New York, but it doesn't seem too strange to suggest that something about living in a kind of spiritual way involves having communal living spaces with people where you actually have to interact with them in the morning and at night when you go to bed. But of course the story is the same as the cars. It's these guys who make a whole bunch of money when we all buy our own place to live, and it's these guys who have the money, and so they make sure that we keep all buying our own place to live. And of course the story continues. These days everyone's got to have their own fancy computer and their own fancy phone and their own fancy education and clothes. And, pretty soon we're all in so much debt that we've given so much power to these guys that they can convince us each to work like crazy at our own individual job to pay back the loans for all the crap that we bought. And of course, we're all pretty convinced that it gets better if you do have a bunch of money because, then you won't have to work so hard to pay them back. But of course, that's not how it is, because if you do have money, then you're supposed to buy your own fancy politician and your own fancy army, and you've still got to go to work for the financial industry to manage to pay for all of it. And it all adds up to a pretty insane way of living for most of us. I mean, maybe you manage to get out of it, at least in your head, and so you think, hey, I want to raise my kid differently, because I think that people should be less concerned with all this stuff that the banks want us to buy and more concerned with the success of their society or something. And maybe you think that people should have more control over their societies than these guys do, and so you try and teach your kid that families and communities are really important. Maybe in the past that would have been good enough, but I'm just not sure it is anymore. I mean, kids go to schools, and I don't think schools are really equipped to produce people who are ready for a life of sharing and community-mindedness. Actually, they seem more equipped to produce people who are, insecure, unloved, and really unskilled, but nevertheless hard-working, who will get jobs so that they can buy houses and cars and expensive education and everything else, and then start paying off their loans to these guys for most of their lives. If you want to make space for people to actually act on a spirituality in which people's day, people's time, people's life aren't just one big piece of quiet desperation, which will turn you into a zombie, like the horse, then maybe you should consider joining me today. It's May Day. It's probably the biggest day of the spring for Occupy. A good time to see what's going on there, and people will be in Bryant Park until around 2, and things will be starting in Union Square around 4. And if you get up and leave right now, you can tell your children that you joined the general strike. Maybe you'll think it's stupid, but then maybe you won't.